This video contains spoilers for Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4, The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask 3D, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil. This is not Resident Evil 4. It's an adaptation of the 2005 GameCube game Resident Evil 4, the way Final Fantasy VII Remake is an adaptation of Final Fantasy VII, the way Metroid Samus Returns is an adaptation of Metroid 2. It's an entirely new game that takes inspiration from an original product, creates something new, and just happens to share a name. Those adaptations are all great, but they don't make me feel like I'm playing the original. It's like if a film class assigned you to watch the 1981 movie The Evil Dead, and you watch the 2013 movie Evil Dead instead. You can't have a conversation with someone who's only experienced the other version. It's not the same thing. Resident Evil 4 is not Resident Evil 4. I don't say that as a slight. I say that because conversations about video game re-releases, remasters, and remakes usually come down to whether or not we're talking about the definitive version. Whether the new release will become the version to play from then on. And for a lot of people, whether the Resident Evil 4 remake is definitive will come down to how it modernizes, by ultimately flattening, the most interesting parts of the 2005 GameCube game, Resident Evil 4. That's the wrong way to look at remakes. To say a remake is definitive implies bullet points, premise, characters, locations, are what define art, but all the little details molded along the way are just as important. An adaptation like the Resident Evil 4 remake can only, even at its best, give us a fractured memory of the original. I don't blame the remake for that. It's not just because this remake is so clearly something different. It's because over the last 18 years, as the original 2005 GameCube game Resident Evil 4 influenced multiple generations of video games and was re-released, remastered, and remade, we've come to collectively misremember Resident Evil 4. And every time another game called Resident Evil 4 comes out, we twist our memory of it even more. Resident Evil was, for a long time, a series about unlocking a spooky puzzle box as you desperately fought for your life against zombies. That's not Resident Evil 4. Instead, Resident Evil 4 is about the pressure of shooting your way out of difficult situations. Shooting enemies is the whole point of Resident Evil 4. Your view of the game is almost always behind Leon Kennedy's back, and rather than simply pointing whatever gun you're toting at the nearest zombie and hoping for the best, you are responsible for where your shots land. That technically makes Resident Evil 4 a shooter, a genre where action is the main focus. That shift towards action, as well as the over-the-shoulder perspective that went on to define most high-budget video games that came after it, is what the game is remembered for. In 2005, that was pretty concerning for people who appreciated Resident Evil as a horror series. How can you be afraid when you can just shoot your way out of every situation? Capcom didn't abandon survival horror with Resident Evil 4. It completely redefined where the horror in survival horror comes from, by perfectly tuning every aspect of this game to blend horror with action. Resident Evil 4 is a shooter, but it wants you to think about when and where you shoot. Despite all the emphasis on action, the game still uses tank controls, which means you turn your character and move forward separately. People chalk this movement style up as being groundbreaking at the time, but outdated now. But that's not completely true. Third and first-person shooters of the time were more nimble than we give them credit for. Plenty of them let you move and shoot at the same time, and plenty of others let you zoom in while doing so. Resident Evil 4 stands apart by restricting you. It's hard to turn and move at the same time, and you have to stop moving to shoot. It took some getting used to both then and now, especially because the GameCube controller is a weird thing to play a shooter on. You aim with the R button and fire with A, which feels strange. But that also requires you to make more calculated decisions, not just reflexive ones. If an enemy is coming at you with an axe, you could just shoot them, but if you're surrounded, turning around, running away for a couple of seconds to reposition yourself, then turning around again and then shooting is probably the way to go. Doing that is a more involved process with a more complex series of inputs than in other games. The laser sight on most of your guns is another point of tension. The large bright red dot that lets you know you'll hit something sways uncontrollably. So waiting for just a moment could mean landing a long-distance shot with your handgun. But at what point do you admit you're going to need the sniper rifle to pull it off, assuming you don't get an axe to the face first? Can you even see the red dot from that far away? Guns feel good to shoot in Resident Evil 4, but not always because they're efficient. The first sniper rifle you can buy is incredibly powerful and has a stupendous reload animation. But you also have to watch Leon helplessly load individual rounds. The TMP can deal massive damage quickly, but the kick on it is so bad you all but have to buy a stock to keep its aim in place. You can't switch weapons on the fly either, so you have to make a conscious decision about when you're going to use each gun. All of these touchstones for the game, the controls, the wavering aim, the major downsides of each gun, don't make Resident Evil 4 the smoothest, most optimal shooter, but instead introduce friction and tension, and push you to make interesting decisions with real trade-offs, and, most importantly, feel like a Resident Evil game. Overcoming its challenges meant learning a unique language. And sure, moving around and shooting might be a little more complicated than we were used to from a shooter in 2005, but properly maneuvering around these spaces to avoid getting hit and wasting as little ammo as possible makes you feel smart and empowered while keeping the game firmly planted in the realm of horror. You do get more ammo than in other Resident Evil games, but that doesn't disqualify Resident Evil 4 from being a horror game. Ammo is a limited resource that's on your mind constantly, and it's just scarce enough and your inventory space just limited enough that you make decisions based on how much ammo you have. Case in point, your knife. You mostly use it to slash open boxes and barrels, but you can save ammo by slicing enemies with it. It's a risk though, because aiming the knife is slow and it takes around 10 slashes to kill an enemy, and you can't really see if enemies are sneaking up on you while you use it. When you eventually do have lots of ammo, you have to figure out where you're going to put it all, and you have to make hard choices like whether one hand grenade is worth 2 eggs, or whether you should reload your sniper rifle when an expensive magazine upgrade that comes with free rounds is just around the corner. Resident Evil 4 also puts you in situations where your ammo doesn't really matter. The first major fight in the village is one of the most talked about encounters in any video game. By this point in most playthroughs, you're still getting the hang of the controls and don't have a ton of ammo. But even if you did, you end up surrounded by more enemies than you could feasibly take on alone, stuck in a series of tight spaces where it's hard to move. You pray for something to save you, and eventually, a bell does exactly that. But even as your ammo count goes up, Resident Evil 4 keeps you on your toes. You may not die during the fight against the two Garadores, but using more than 2 or 3 healing items might get you to reload the checkpoint because, well, that's really going to hamper you later on. So you enter that hall not necessarily afraid that you'll die, but that you'll suffer a worse fate, losing too many resources. That's survival horror. Everything about Resident Evil 4, the controls, the economy, the enemies, push you to make interesting choices, both small and large, constantly, and shooting enemies is the most important choice. Sure, being able to aim at enemies directly might give you more power, but it also gives you more responsibility. If it takes you 5 shots to kill an enemy because you went for body blows instead of headshots, you can't just shrug it off and blame it on randomness like you might in other Resident Evil games. It's on you. I never died because I didn't have enough ammo, but died several times playing the original GameCube game in 2023 because I couldn't make decisions fast enough to keep up. Resident Evil 4 is about the terror of being given the agency to make a decision, then, in the heat of the moment, making the wrong one. That's a very different kind of terror than in earlier Resident Evil games. But for all its emphasis on action, Resident Evil 4 makes a remarkable case for the shooter as a vehicle for horror. Every part of it is tuned not just to make you feel powerful, but confined, scared, and ultimately, smart. Resident Evil 4 may be something entirely different from its predecessors, but it preserves the essence of Resident Evil, and by maintaining a meticulous balance between action and horror all the way through, is one of the best games I have ever played. Resident Evil 4 HD is more or less Resident Evil 4, but it's also not the game I played in 2005. The 2014 game Resident Evil 4 HD, sometimes called the Ultimate HD Edition, and which is not to be confused for Resident Evil 4 HD for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, or the fan-made mod Resident Evil 4 HD Project, is the kind of re-release I like most. A game that ostensibly lets you play a classic game with all the bells and whistles of a modern release. Resident Evil 4 running on modern platforms looks better, runs better, and the controls have been streamlined to feel better. But playing Resident Evil 4 HD, I realized better isn't always better. For one, parts of the HD version look bad. The updated textures are higher resolution and show you all the gritty details of the guns and healing items, but I think they look worse. Even the fan-made HD project mod, which goes back and updates all of those textures, doesn't really do it for me. There are some places where the old textures can be really distracting, but for the most part, I think seeing these things in their full glory highlights how this game really was made for TVs with much lower resolutions. But what gets to me most about this version of the game is how it shows that over the years, Resident Evil 4 has slowly morphed into more of an action game, both literally and in our collective memory. Resident Evil 4 has been ported to almost every platform you can think of since it came out on the GameCube in 2005. Every time that's happened, Resident Evil 4 has changed in minor but meaningful ways that have made it more about action and less about survival. They've warped how we've come to remember Resident Evil 4 without most of us really noticing, to the point where Resident Evil 4 HD, the most easily available version of the game, is a pretty different game. The first port of Resident Evil 4 I played was the Wii version in 2007. By then, Resident Evil 4's over-the-shoulder camera had influenced an entire generation of shooters, so Resident Evil 4 came to be known as the godfather of the modern third-person shooter. Its bona fides as a survival horror game were already being forgotten. By the time Resident Evil 4 came to the Wii, the PS2 version had already upped the damage on the knife and most of the handguns, and made it much easier to take out larger groups of ganados. All of these changes made encounters go by more quickly and smoothly, like they would in other shooters. In the Wii version, aiming is more precise by using motion controls instead of a laser sight. The knife is faster and it does way more damage, which means the trade-off of saving resources by using the knife to finish off enemies goes from interesting decision to no-brainer. It's by far the easiest version of the game, one where you still need to think about how to move around, but more of your decisions are automatic, like in an action game. I definitely noticed how much easier it was to aim on the Wii, but I didn't notice all the other smaller changes because, not having played the original in a while, the pace of the game more or less lined up with how I'd come to remember it, as an action game. Later versions did scale back the knife, but kept most everything else and made more changes that cemented Resident Evil 4's reputation as a seminal action game, but eroded its reputation as a unique one. The Xbox 360 version made it so you tap left trigger to aim, right trigger to shoot, and X to reload, like in every other shooter. The 2014 PC version, the one we have today, gave us sick mouse aiming, a consistent 60 frames per second, and, with the HD Project mod, even more real gamer things like a field of view slider. These all made Resident Evil 4 more modern, but less distinct than the GameCube version. Remasters and re-releases are all about quality of life, chances to modernize games by making them more optimal and ironing out kinks. For Resident Evil 4, it also means it's something slightly different to every generation of players who touch it for the first time. There are people who swear by the easier Wii version, or love the comfort and speed of the more precise PC version. Those takes aren't wrong. That's what the game is in later versions, and if that version is the one that clicked with you, that's great. With the caveat that games as a whole should let players remap a game's controls for the sake of accessibility, re-releases that update a game's control scheme to make them fit a collective standard often homogenize and flatten some of the most important parts of their identity. With Resident Evil 4, that meant making it less of a horror game. And now, after all these changes that made it more of a shooter, that's how everyone thinks of Resident Evil 4, as a shooter. And because every game inspired by it chose to enhance the action qualities of that third-person, over-the-shoulder perspective, Resident Evil 4 became more of an action game and less a survival horror game in our minds. It doesn't help that by now, people know Resident Evil 4 pretty well. Over the course of 18 years, we've learned ways to make the game easier. You can defang the first big fight in the village by repeatedly climbing and jumping down the ladder in the bell tower. Krauser, the boss that gave me the most trouble the first time around, takes more damage from your knife, and after you learn that, he's not so bad. You learn which bosses are worth buying a rocket launcher for so you can just skip them, and after repeated playthroughs, the game naturally becomes more about its action than its horror. And if you haven't played it in a while, you end up remembering its legacy as much as the actual game, and the legacy tells you it's been an action game all along. But as a result, what Resident Evil 4 is to me starts to fade away. I used to not be this guy. I used to be one of those people who said things like, oh, they're porting the GameCube remake of Resident Evil to PC and adding modern controls. Awesome. Don't need to play the original. I used to think people who said things like, this classic game is ruined by a higher frame rate and resolution were out of their minds. But then it happens to your favorite game. I think I have a pretty good case with Resident Evil 4. The muddier resolution makes it more interesting to try to get a beat on people, and it should. And the frame rate, okay, maybe the higher frame rate is objectively a good thing. I don't think you should go out and spend way too much money on a GameCube copy. I'm saying you should emulate it. All you gotta do, as much as porting and updating a game makes it more available, accessible, and convenient, things can't help but change when they're ported. There are the big ones, like changing the locations of items and characters so they're more convenient or make more sense, or adding a whole new way of lighting things. But there are also smaller changes, like how a line read gets altered by changing the timing of how it shows up on screen. These things don't tend to come back when we change them, so we forget all about them. As ports smoothed out the so-called rough edges in Resident Evil 4, we lost that perfectly balanced blend of horror and action. It was replaced by the definitive action game of the last 20 years that is also a little spooky sometimes. And we haven't gone back. Resident Evil 4 HD is different in all these ways, sure, but this version is, on the whole, still recognizable as Resident Evil 4, and changes aside, still one of the best games ever made. The survival horror of it all isn't totally gone. There are parts in this game that are still pretty scary, like when you first walk into the sewers and individual levels and encounters are just consistently clever as hell, for reasons that often have little to do with how the game looks or controls. There are only a handful of sections I'd call regular encounters. For example, sometime after that iconic village section, you end up at the Del Lagos boss fight. Another incredible fight where it doesn't matter how much ammo you have. From there, you learn enemies will just sometimes spawn tentacles out of their heads, fight your first El Gigante, run back through a couple of areas from the first chapter with less visibility, swarms of new enemies, bear traps, and Ashley to worry about, hole up in a shack with Luis to fend off ganados, choose to fight another El Gigante or two chainsaw-wielding sisters, snipe a bunch of poor saps while riding a gondola, and then fight Mendez, back to back to back. This game does not let up for its entire runtime, even on the island. The guy who explodes out of a door, the Regeneradores, the both Krauser fights, are you kidding me? Then there's Chapter 5-4, the chapter people think of when they talk about how Resident Evil 4 abandoned the Resident Evil series roots to chase the allure of third-person shooters. Yeah, it's all action by this point, but in context, it's less, oh, so this is just an action game now, and more of the final clever trick the game pulls on you, turning combat into a literal war zone. It's right at the end of the game, and no other section has been like this. So it's the capstone to a bunch of other clever ideas that are nothing like this fight. There are also all these gags the game plays on you. There's this moment late in the game where you encounter 3 enemies behind a shutter that only opens when you're far enough away, and the shutter keeps closing and showing you new enemies until you clear them all out. It's an interactive joke in the middle of all this action. It's not the only gag either, and they all feel very of a time and place, things that wouldn't have the same effect if you recreated them now. So yes, in 2023, the game marked Resident Evil 4 2005 on Steam is, despite all the changes, an irreplaceable masterpiece. It's just not the game I played in 2005. And in our rush to want to see old games re-released, remastered, remade, and readapted, we shouldn't be so quick to throw out the old for the new. Playing the GameCube version for the first time in years, it really is a different beast. It's significantly more difficult in a way that just upping the difficulty to professional can't replace. The original version of Resident Evil 4 is a survival horror masterpiece in a way the other versions are not. So yes, Resident Evil 4 HD looks better, runs better, and has better controls. But better isn't always better. Resident Evil 4 VR is nothing like Resident Evil 4. That's the brilliant thing about it. Resident Evil 4 takes place in the same areas, has the same characters, and most of the same assets as the updated HD versions. I recognize it in many places as the game I played in 2005. But if you want to relive the magic of Resident Evil 4 in VR, this is not that. And I absolutely prefer it that way. Instead of trying to preserve the essence of a game it couldn't possibly replicate, the VR version uses the textures, level layouts, and gameplay of Resident Evil 4 as a playground to go buck wild and be one of the best VR games I've ever played. In Resident Evil 4 VR, You can shoot while moving. Pretty quickly, in fact. Most of the game is in first person. You can knife enemies super fast on the ground while peeking up to see if anyone else is coming at you. You can easily pull off shots that are impossible in any other version. All grenades are on timers now, which lets you pull off some sick-ass moves like this. All of these changes make the game more fun to play in VR and make it more of an action game. But the extent to which it does that is just so absurd, it's hard to get mad at it. This game makes no bones about being something completely different. The fact that these levels work so well in tandem with the new gameplay feels like a total coincidence. It's not. My favorite thing about the VR version, though, is how, by amping up everything about the gameplay several notches, it actually brings some of the horror back to Resident Evil 4. It understands how the changes needed to make Resident Evil 4 feel good to play in VR make you much more powerful. But unlike every other re-release, it keeps that power creep in check. Enemies are much more numerous, nimble, and aggressive. You might not notice if you haven't played Resident Evil 4 in a while, but if you have, it's actually unsettling how relentless Ganados are. Guns feel more powerful and efficient, but there are also new downsides. Every gun has its own reloading mechanic. You have to grab and slide each clip of a handgun yourself, use the bolt handle of the sniper rifle to load individual rounds, and click the magazine of the striker shotgun into place after you reload it. There are additional steps that feel cool, but also double as a way to check your presence of mind in the middle of these faster encounters. You might be able to swap among your weapons, knife, and grenades on the fly, but you can also fumble pulling out the right weapon. The changes may not be true to the original, but they make the game scarier, more tense, and at times more difficult. That first big fight in the village is actually scary again, because you don't have a handle on your guns quite yet, and the enemies rapidly chase you around all the narrow corridors. The VR version breathes new life into Resident Evil 4, and made me appreciate just how timeless the things that haven't changed, the environments, the set pieces, are, all these years later. Resident Evil 4 VR is a wildly different experience than the original, but it's gotten me to appreciate the game as a whole even more, especially as a horror game. That newfound fear, the moments where your gun doesn't fire because you forget to load it correctly and you die, feel more true to Resident Evil 4 than any other update or port. In Resident Evil 4 VR, you have more agency than ever, but in the heat of the moment, could make the wrong decision. That's what Resident Evil 4 is. The Resident Evil 4 Remake is a fantastic video game. It's a third-person shooter where shooting feels great, but in which you want to shoot as infrequently as possible. It's a survival horror game that has you terrified of the next ridiculous one-off set piece, where you doubt whether you'll actually survive a boss fight. It's telling a ridiculous story, but keeps a serious face, making its camp all the more satisfying. It's a relatively short game, where action and tension come first, but where so many systems and secrets reveal themselves over time that you'll want to play all the way through it multiple times. But it is not Resident Evil 4. The 2023 remake of Resident Evil 4 and the original Resident Evil 4 have a lot of things in common. They're both shooters where you have to think about where and when you shoot, where scaring the player is as important as empowering them. A lot of the environments look and are modeled similar, but they are entirely different in every other way. The remake takes a lot of ideas from the original, but like most modern blockbuster video game remakes, stratifies them into something more elaborate. On the surface, comparing the remake with the original will make it sound like the new version is an unequivocal improvement. The visuals are much higher fidelity, there is more overall content, both in the campaign itself and in bonus modes and incentives to play through the game multiple times. But not every change is necessarily better. The original game's tank controls and the way moving, shooting, and reloading were all mutually exclusive, emphasize putting yourself in the right place at the right time. In the remake, you can pretty much do any of them whenever you want. If an enemy attacks you, you can duck, parry, dodge, or otherwise react to it in some way most of the time. The way to avoid enemy attacks in the original game was to just not be near them. It's kind of ironic that early on, the biggest impediment to me enjoying the remake were the controls. At first, moving around felt sluggish. It takes a split second longer than I like for Leon to get to full speed when he sprints, and it's not exactly the world's fastest run. And while you can aim, shoot, and reload interchangeably, there's more spread on weapons than you think. Something the aiming reticle communicates, but you also need to wait a second after getting a beat on an enemy to make your aim as deadly and accurate as possible. The treasure system in the original, in which you found jewels that fit only into certain treasures, now lets you fit more jewels into more kinds of treasures. There are multipliers and modifiers that turn it into more of a math problem. Puzzles are more complicated, areas have been expanded and are less straightforward. None of those things are, to me, improvements or downgrades. One game is elegant, simple, and idiosyncratic. The other is more methodical, systemically and visually dense, and a best-in-class third-person shooter. The differences between the two are only changes if you think of them as two versions of the same game. This remake doesn't modernize anything. It creates something new. Something that's great in its own right, but not as a copy of Resident Evil 4. Even when the remake looks the most like its inspiration, it can't help but be completely different. That first major village fight might look remarkably similar in the remake, but tons of little things are different. There's a locked drawer, the key for which isn't in the area, and a gap in the wall that actually lets you enter the first building on the left this time, after you've found Ashley. These are hints that you're going to be doing some major backtracking, something you didn't really do much in the original. I could list major things like this all day, and it's fun. There are stealth kills, you can parry attacks, which is huge. The chainsaw guys can cut off certain parts of the map, which is terrifying the first time it happens. The tower you could use to avoid the entire encounter collapses now. The cows can light on fire and go fucking nuts, as they should. There's a new window in one of the houses. These differences collectively change the feel of the first encounter enough that, as much as this place looks like the one I've been fighting in for 18 years, it was a completely different experience. This is the case for the entire game. You basically do the second chapter backwards, and the valley area is more interactive. You don't get free ammo when you upgrade a weapon's magazine capacity, and all the numbers on the guns are all different. You get attaché case upgrades much earlier. The new lock and key system means you're much more thorough about combing every area, which changes the pacing of the game. The lake you fight Delago in is now fully explorable, and there are new areas in it. The minecart section is more of a turret sequence than an actual gameplay section, but you actually play the first fight against Krauser now. Characters are radically altered visually, are voiced by different actors, and enter and leave the story at different points. That sewer section is completely gone, and so is that shutter gag. For all of the differences, the Resident Evil 4 Remake is a game where you have so much more agency about your actions, but in the heat of the moment, you can make the wrong decision. That, in some way, is Resident Evil 4. In fact, this is significantly more of a survival horror game than the original. The shooting feels great, but the ammo economy is much more stringent in a way that really makes landing your shots and waiting just a moment so you can land a critical hit super rewarding. Knife parries are fun as hell to pull off, but the fact that those knives eventually break makes you think twice before you parry. It's hard not to meticulously explore when the jewel that could skyrocket the value of a treasure you have could be in a locked drawer that you don't have the key for yet. And for every shutter or sewer encounter that doesn't appear, there are new incredible set pieces in the remake. Like the part where you're running through the outside of a castle while an armored El Gigante lobs rocks at you, or all the new optional quests and boss fights. I don't mind any of these changes because they're not changes. They're new features in a new game that shouldn't be thought of as the definitive version of Resident Evil 4, but a companion to it. If you thought the island was the worst part of the original game and don't think that after playing the remake, it's not because your memory was wrong, or that you've changed your mind about the original product. The remake is so different that is no longer a relevant comparison. You can't have a conversation with someone who's only played the other version. This is not Resident Evil 4. You can't totally separate it from its inspiration, though. I can say that I'd prefer Capcom just have this team make an entirely new Resident Evil game instead of going back to the well, but I can't deny that I like this game more because it's called Resident Evil 4. I love that this is more or less an entirely new Resident Evil game that just happens to, at every turn, remind me of one of my favorite games of all time. And I love the way it messes with people who've played that game. That's way more interesting than if it were just the same game with a new coat of graphics. This game stands on its own as one of the greatest survival horror games of all time. But I don't think I will ever love it as much as the 2005 GameCube game Resident Evil 4. I mean, of course I'd say that. I haven't played through the remake over a dozen times yet. I didn't play the remake when I was an impressionable 13-year-old. I haven't seen it influence multiple generations of video games and, in my head, warp that history into some inarguable measure of not just its historical impact, but its inherent quality. I'm glad that rather than try to replicate that legacy, the Resident Evil 4 remake instead creates its own. Because maybe one day, after I've played it a dozen times, combed every inch of it, learned every gameplay beat by heart, and had 18 more years to think about how great it is, it'll wind up on my list of the best games of all time, just like the original. Maybe. But what I know for sure is that it'll be a separate entry. Because as good as it is, and as good as any remake might be, they are not the original. We forget that more than we think. The way we talk about remakes feels off right now. We want remakes to be faithful, but also definitive. We want them to improve and streamline, but also maintain some sort of essence of the original. We want them to be the same, but also totally different. And the conversation changes completely depending on the game. I think most people will acknowledge that the Resident Evil 4 remake is essentially a new game. And yet, the inclination to talk about returning to Resident Evil 4 through this remake, or how parts of it still hold up, means talking about one game as if it were another. And to think of the Resident Evil 4 remake as the definitive version of the original not only erases the original, but does the remake a disservice. One reason I love Resident Evil 4 VR is because it doesn't try to be definitive. I never got the sense that this was meant to be what Resident Evil is now, like it or not. And if you want the original game, you're going to have to set up your GameCube again. Or just emulate it. That's usually the implication of every remake like this new one. Because that's what people want. Video games are more tied to the technology they're made for than movies or books, so they very quickly lose the kind of ease of access we take for granted in other mediums. We want the convenience to access older games on new hardware, and once a game is old enough, companies need to re-release it just so people will bother to actually go back to it. You can just emulate it. But that's my point. I don't think most people will bother to even do that. When people talk about how a game has aged, they mostly mean that it doesn't abide by the more flattened, homogenized control schemes and feature sets of modern video games. The problem with that is that it narrows our tolerance for unique and exciting control schemes, and by extension how we interact with games, and what those games can allow. Say what you will about Resident Evil's tank controls, but they're one of the most memorable parts of that game. I don't think the Resident Evil 4 remake will be remembered for its control scheme, or that it'll influence another generation of video games. I get it. Old games are hard to go back to. I'm the guy who really only played through the original Resident Evil when they redid the graphics and got rid of the tank controls. There are games I don't have much desire to go back to, but which I would love to play remakes of. The thing about remakes, though, is that they always forget something. We tend to think of re-releases as universal upgrades. They increase the resolution and frame rate, so why wouldn't every other change also be an upgrade? But ports always change less noticeable things, and usually don't let you change them back. And when we forget about those changes, we warp our understanding of those games. You'll notice, for example, that the HD remake of Resident Evil I love so much has all but gotten us to forget the original. It's why, as well made as it is, I can't help but resent the 2019 game Resident Evil 2. It is definitely not the 1998 game Resident Evil 2. It's an adaptation. But because of that game, the original Resident Evil 2 isn't available on any modern platform, and may not ever be. Anyone who wants to experience the entire Resident Evil series is either gonna have to dig up old consoles, emulate it, or make do with the remake. I think most people are gonna opt for the latter. So the 1998 classic PlayStation game Resident Evil 2 will be slowly transformed into a footnote, just like its predecessor. Resident Evil 4 is safe from that, for now. It's not the original game by my nitpicky standards, but the versions you can play right now are, by and large, good enough translations of the original GameCube game that I can have a conversation with someone who's played those versions. But if Capcom decides this remake is the version they're going to port everywhere from now on instead of the original, there's a real chance that after the original Resident Evil 4 stops getting re-released, that we're not much more than a digital delisting away from this remake being the only way to experience something called Resident Evil 4. That's a worst case scenario, but I think you can see it. A future where maybe 18 years from now, some fledgling video game fan wants to play Resident Evil 4 and someone tells them, just play the remake. In that moment, the 2005 GameCube masterpiece Resident Evil 4 starts becoming a footnote. That's why I feel so compelled to say the Resident Evil 4 remake is not Resident Evil 4. Because when we forget that, when we're okay with good enough ports and lavishly made adaptations as replacements for originals, we flatten and homogenize them according to histories that aren't entirely true. That's human, but also tragic, because if we forget Resident Evil 4, years and years from now, we'll have lost a one-of-a-kind control scheme, set of item placements, stats, level layouts, fights, and gags that combine into something deeper than any beautifully rendered, remade Village at Dusk could replicate. There's more than one Resident Evil 4, and they're all great, but there's only one.
Resident Evil 4.